and I think most of them don't really they don't hate the other side. It's sort of like, there's this saying about, like this saying comes from World War I. It's like young boys who don't know each other killing each other on behalf of old men that do know each other. The hell's the point of that?
So Volodymyr Zelensky said that he's not, or has said in the past, he's not interested in talking to Putin directly. Do you think he should sit down, man to man, leader to leader, and negotiate peace?
Look, I think I would just recommend, do not send the flower of Ukrainian youth to die in trenches. Whether he talks to Putin or not, just don't do that. Whoever goes on the offensive will lose massive numbers of people. And history will not look kindly upon them.
You've spoken honestly about the possibility of war between U.S. and China in the long term, if no diplomatic solution is found. For example, on the question of Taiwan and one China policy.
Right.
How do we avoid the trajectory where these two superpowers clash?
Well, it's worth reading that book on the difficult to pronounce Thucydides trap, I believe it's called. I love war history. I like inside out and backwards. There's hardly a battle I haven't read about. And trying to figure out, like, what really was the cause of victory in any particular case, as opposed to what one side or another claimed was the reason.
Both the victory and what sparked the war. And
yeah.
The whole thing.
Yeah. So that Athens and Sparta is a classic case. The thing about the Greeks is they really wrote down a lot of stuff. They loved writing.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of interesting things that happened in many parts of the world, but people just didn't write down. Mm-hmm. So we don't know what happened, or they didn't really write in detail. They just would say, like, we had a battle and we won. And like, well, what? Can you add a bit more? The Greeks, they really wrote a lot. They were very articulate on it. They just love writing. So, and we have a bunch of that writing that's preserved. So we know what led up to the Peloponnesian War between the Spartan and Athenian alliance. And we know that they saw it coming. I mean, the Spartans didn't write. They also weren't very verbose by their nature, but they did write, but they weren't very verbose. They were terse. But the Athenians and the other Greeks wrote a lot, and they were like, and Sparta was really kind of like the leader of Greece. But Athens grew stronger and stronger with each passing year, and everyone's like, well, that's inevitable that there's going to be a clash between Athens and Sparta. Well, how do we avoid that? And they couldn't. They saw it coming, and they still could not avoid it. So, at some point, if one group, one civilization or country or whatever exceeds another, sort of like if the United States has been the biggest kid on the block since I think around 1890 from an economic standpoint. So the United States has been the most powerful economic engine in the world longer than anyone's been alive. And the foundation of war is economics. So now we have a situation in the case of China where the economy is likely to be 2, perhaps 3 times larger than that of the U.S. So imagine you're the biggest kid on the block for as long as anyone can remember, and suddenly a kid comes along who's twice your size.
So we see it coming.
Yeah.
How is it possible to stop? Is there some, let me throw something out there, just intermixing of cultures, understanding? There does seem to be a giant cultural gap in understanding of each other. And you're an interesting case study because you are an American, obviously. Mm-hmm. You've done a lot of incredible manufacture here in the United States, but you also work with China.
I've spent a lot of time in China and met with the leadership many times.
Maybe a good question to ask is, what are some things about China that people don't understand, positive, just in the culture? What's some interesting things that you've learned about the Chinese?
Well, The sheer number of really smart, hardworking people in China is incredible. There are really, if you say like how many smart, hardworking people are there in China, there's far more of them there than there are here, I think, in my opinion. And they've got a lot of energy. So, I mean, the architecture in China that's in recent years is far more impressive than the U.S. I mean, the train stations, the buildings, the high-speed rail, everything, it's really far more impressive than what we have in the U.S. I mean, I recommend somebody just go to Shanghai and Beijing, look at the buildings, and go to, take the train from Beijing to Xi'an, where you have the terracotta warriors. China's got an incredible history, very long history. And, I think arguably in terms of the use of language from a written standpoint, sort of one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest written language. And in China, people did write things down. So now China historically has always been, with rare exception, been internally focused. They've not been acquisitive. They've fought each other. There have been many, many civil wars. In the Three Kingdoms War, I believe they lost about 70% of their population. So they've had brutal internal wars, like civil wars that make the U.S. Civil War look small by comparison. So I think it's important to appreciate that China is not monolithic. We sort of think of like China as this sort of one entity of one mind, and this is definitely not the case. From what I've seen, and I think most people who understand China would agree, that people in China think about China 10 times more than they think about anything outside of China. So it's like 90% of their consideration is internal.
Well, isn't that a really positive thing when you're talking about the collaboration and a future peace between superpowers? When you're inward facing, which is like focusing on improving yourself versus focusing on, quote unquote, improving others through military might.
The good news, the history of China suggests that China is not acquisitive, meaning they're not going to go out and invade a whole bunch of countries. Now they do feel very strongly, so that's good. I mean, because a lot of very powerful countries have been acquisitive. The U.S. is also one of the rare cases that has not been acquisitive. Like after World War II, the U.S. could have basically taken over the world and any country. Like we got nukes, nobody else got nukes. We don't even have to lose soldiers. Which country do you want? And the United States could have taken over everything. At will, and it didn't. And the United States actually helped rebuild countries. So it helped rebuild Europe, helped rebuild Japan. This is very unusual behavior, almost unprecedented. The U.S. did conspicuous acts of kindness, like the Berlin airlift. And I think it's always like, well, America's done bad things. Well, of course, America's done bad things, but one needs to look at the whole track record. And just generally,